Hi, everybody. My name is Justin Reich. I'm going to be sharing work that I've done with a whole group of my colleagues. Um, Maybe I'll frame the challenge that we were working on in two ways. Think about as an instructional designer working with typical learning management system kinds of things, like what is the instructional palette of resources that you have available? You want to make content available to people, you can show them a video, you want to see how people are doing, you can ask them a multiple choice question. If you have some more time for grading, you can ask them an open response item, you can have them solve a math problem, you can have them talk in discussion forums. Those are good for all kinds of things that people do. One of the things that we do all across education is that we try to teach people how to interact with other people, how to address improvisational interactions, particularly those in which you want someone to be able to say something and to be able to say it with some proficiency, to improvise well, those kinds of things. We thought that kind of pigment was missing from the palette that instructional designers have. So we've been trying to design a platform for digital clinical simulations that let professionals rehearse for and reflect on important decisions in management in their professional work, for us, particularly in teaching. Here's a second intuition. Practice is essential for learning. For whatever reason, in the field of simulation design, when people have thought of simulations, they have often quickly, especially technologists, I think, quickly moved to how could we make this as realistic as possible? How could we immerse people in an environment, like we'll put them in VR headsets and we'll train them with actors and we'll have them talk to AI bots and all these kinds of things. I think there's some virtue to that. But a lot of times, actually, when we want to practice stuff, we don't want high fidelity practice. We want to abstract away the complexity of the situation. And we want to be able to do practice that's quick, that's flexible, that's repeatable, that's cheap, that's movable from place to place, that we actually don't want a lot of technological sophistication. Anyone who's ever been an athlete will immediately understand this intuition because you don't spend all of your time scrimmaging. You actually spend only a little bit of time scrimmaging, which is kind of like the game. You probably spend a lot of time doing drills. Some of those drills are a little bit more complex and improvisational, like a 2-on-1 breakaway drill, and some drills are, like this guy who just puts a bunch of soccer balls down and starts whacking them at the net. But if you want to have a good foot, that's the way that you get better. We think if you want to be good at interacting with people, you need to have environments. You might need environments that are like the one in the top left, but you also might need environments that are like the one in the bottom right. So we've built this open source, openly licensed software called the Digital Clinical Simulation Suite, or DEX. The intuition is pretty simple. For users, they would participate in it like it's a mobile app. And so we immerse them in vignettes of professional life, through video, through images, through text, and then periodically a microphone icon pops up and you have to say what you would say to the person in that scenario in that moment. You can also have people respond by typing in text. You can have people respond through radio buttons. They can branch and things like that. But I actually think the sort of one of the main reasons we built it, especially even for our prototyping, was for the audio input. With the professionals that we work with, we want them to say exactly what they would say to that person in that moment. And it turned out that there weren't other things out there. You could simulate most of what we do in DEX in like SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics, at least the early versions. But most of those things don't have a good audio input. And that was pretty critical to us. So if the video gods will bless us, here's what it looks like to use. I want to be super clear. We cannot change the schedules at this point. Sometimes imbalances will happen when you only offer one section of a course, like we're doing this year with Intro to CS. We're offering Intro to CS during period 5. I mean, it's super complicated. We're offering Intro to CS in period 5. We're offering Algebra in period 5 and period 1. So anyone who has Intro to CS for period 5 just is going to have to take Algebra in period 1. What if I got you a teaching assistant to help with the class?
I disagree. I don't think it's super complicated. There are a few weeks left before school starts, and we change kids' schedules all the time. And I don't think a teaching assistant would solve the underlying problem. Why can't we look into changing when math courses are scheduled so that all kids can have a chance to take computer science if they want?
So this is a little snippet from a digital clinical simulation that we built for a course called Becoming a More Equitable Educator, Mindsets and Practices. And it's for a unit about courageous conversations. It's really hard if you're a new teacher to talk directly to your principal, but we want teachers to talk about issues of discrimination, issues of racial discrimination, issues of opportunity. If we want them to be good at that, they have to practice it. And there's lots of ways that we can make them practice it. And we've tried to come up with one that's pretty simple and straightforward. So this wouldn't exist by itself. This would be embedded in some kind of larger learning environment, some kind of online course, some kind of face-to-face experience. There's briefings at the beginning of these kinds of scenarios. We often ask people questions about their values related to a particular circumstance before we immerse them in a situation where those values are tested. We can pipe their responses forward, either as transcripts or as audio, so they can listen to those, they can reflect. There's a back end which allows the facilitator to see all the responses from a cohort of people going through things, and so they can sort of quickly analyze, hey, about half of you said something like this, and about half of you said something like this. What are the sort of two responses that are there? And then there's quite a technologically sophisticated back end to all this, although a key principle for us is that the front end of the system just has to be like as dirt simple for people to use as possible. We're particularly interested in using this in teacher education. The vast majority of teacher education, it's done in about 1,500 institutions. Most of them are community colleges, state colleges. They're not super well resourced institutions. They don't have a ton of technical support for faculty, so we want to make sure it's easy to use. If you were, well, that's not nearly as interesting. So that's what we do. Another really important idea to us is that we and MIT maybe have some ideas, but we really don't know what people should practice. As Garron was talking about from our group this morning, the people who know what to practice are the ones who are closest to these problems. So it's really important to us that we're not trying to create a sort of authoritative set of simulations that we distribute out to the world, but we actually say, how can we empower local professional educators, whether nursing educators, teaching educators, managerial educators, whoever else wants to use this, to be able to author their own scenario. So for professional educators, their interface, it looks a little bit like a cross between Google Slides and Qualtrics. So on the left, there's a series of slides which organize the scenarios. On the right, there's a series of interactive elements that you could pull into a slide, and then you can author scenarios through slide. For most people who are professional educators, it's really pretty simple for them to be able to use. We probably have about 250 people who are using this system right now. They've created about 800 scenarios and about 13,000 participants who've had something to do with it thus far. Garron is more comfortable using this language than I am, but I think he's right. That to us, we feel like there's an effort at decolonializing technology here. We're not trying to create the one central thing that we're right and we pass it on to you, but we're saying who out there has good ideas about how to do this and how can we empower them with the tools to create learning experience in their own environment. Again, if you don't lower the technology floor pretty low, if you build like some super fancy high fidelity simulation, it's very unlikely that your partners who are actually doing this training way out in the field will be able to edit and author that simulation themselves. Just to give you, I guess, a little bit more context on that, and then I'll give you a couple examples of some studies that we've done with it so far. There's a woman named Pam Grossman, who's the dean of the Graduate School of Education at Penn, who studied how people in the helping professions learn, things like nursing and teaching and social work and the clergy. And they basically have three parts of their pedagogy. There's representation. That's where you see some kind of practice. You watch videos of teaching or you look at lesson plans. There's decomposition, where an expert watches the first 2 minutes of a class with novices and says, that's not just any first 2 minutes. That's called a lesson launch. And the lesson launch is like a particular set of features. And when it's done well, there's a series of principles behind it and here's some practical guidelines. And then ideally, there would be opportunities for approximation. We are primarily focused on serving teachers. In other helping fields, they're pretty good at that step of approximation. So if you were to watch social workers learn, they therapize each other all the time. If you were to watch clergy members learn, apparently they practice funerals all the time. The funeral intake interview, your first funeral sermon. Apparently, if you take over a new congregation, you can't screw up your first funeral. Teachers, for a variety of reasons, have far fewer opportunities for approximation. It is not common in a week of teacher education that you would get a chance to practice that. You can practice the preparation stuff. They'll make you write lesson plans and some things like that. It's much harder to do high repetition, low stakes, frequent repetition of teaching. And the systems that do exist are kind of complicated. You can say, hey, Candace, you're going to do a 10-minute mini lesson, and then about 10 of you are going to be students, and each of you in my class is going to get a chance to do a 10-minute mini lesson. That takes about a third of a semester in a methods course to let everyone do that kind of scrimmage. There's some really cool work that's been done by Liz Self at Vanderbilt about creating actor-based simulations. Really rich experiences to interact with people who've been trained to role play as students or parents or paraprofessionals. But again, logistically really complicated to get everyone to do those one-on-one matching. Folks may know about this tool called Immersion, which is like a digital puppetry kind of simulation. There's one actor who's got a little Xbox controller that can control 5 kids and a little voice modulator. It's pretty neat. It's also really hard for regular people to author scenarios in there. And again, the logistical complications are tricky. One of the ways that we map this out, another thing about most of those practice opportunities is that they try to get people to do the whole complex assemblage of teaching at once. I think we have good research from the cognitive science of complex instruction. It's really hard for novices to practice everything and to get good at individual components. If you want people to practice, you have to abstract away some of that complexity, let them develop some automaticity, some heuristics, some principles in less complex, isolated, high repetition environments, and then integrate those skills back into the complex whole. So we sort of observed this space in the upper left for digital focused things, individual skills as kind of an unexplored design place that is where Teacher Moments fits. And I gave you this metaphor of scrimmages and drills. We're not the first people to work on this, so I have to talk about this for a minute. With the National Defense Education Act of 1958, Bert Kirsch at Oregon built this system where there's an instructor who sits at a desk. The desk has controllers for 3 film projectors that are each loaded with 20 film strips. And a teaching student candidate stands in front of a reverse projection screen and like watches a little film of a kid coming in and being like, Johnny kicked me at recess. And then he has to say what he would say when Johnny kicked me at recess. And depending upon what the person says, the experiment, the sort of facilitator plays like one of the 3 next film strips, and there's like a choose your own adventure of up to 60. And if you read the report, it's awesome. If you repeat the reports on this, they say all the kinds of things that I've just been saying. Like teachers need opportunities to practice. It needs to feel sort of realistic. They need you repeatedly. One thing that they say that we don't is that they organize it around these behaviorist principles. And so there are some like well-defined right answers for each one of these things. And if you get it wrong, they buzz you or something like that. No, they make you do it over again. But it's a good reminder that if you ever think you have an idea in education technology that's new, it's very unlikely that you do. That Bert Kirsch did it in 1958, long before you. These are some of the design principles that I've talked about, that community adaptation is crucial for us, that we build a tool that other people can use in their context, that there might be a lot of technological sophistication, but our users should not experience it at the front end. They should be able to pick up their phones and do stuff. We do not have to make everything authentic. If I were to give you a great piece of fiction, you would be able to conjure that world in your imagination very, very vividly. The piece that has to be authentic is the task that we ask you to do. The role you're in, the context, all other kinds of things that we can fake. The task has to be authentic. And for us, improvisational voice is like the key part of that authentic task. How do we get teachers, other professionals to say what they would say to a colleague in that hard moment? We think a lot about who gets what data. And then we think it's crucial in most learning experiences that people do this in communities with that they do some of their own self-reflection, that they get feedback from other people. But we did build an extensible AI infrastructure, not to try to like have AI chatbots who talk to you. I joke with my AI colleagues about this. I'm like, if we let you guys make a fake student or something like that, he's just going to be spouting racist nonsense in no time. We actually script most of the environments, but we think where AI maybe can be helpful is that we can detect sort of interesting features of things that people say along the way, and maybe give them some reflection questions that are attuned to their particular responses to particular questions. So the architecture of the system, it's built in a series of modules. There's an authoring module where pretty much every element becomes a kind of JSON blob, and those blobs get rendered into slides. Those slides get rendered into scenarios. Those get sort of dehydrated and put in the system, and then rehydrated on your phone in a series of slides with these different kinds of interactive elements. One of the things that we did, because this always used to drive me nuts with edX or other learning management systems, there's an ID for each prompt, each thing you have to do. But actually, the moment you do a thing, we also record this thing called a prompt response ID, which is basically like, what was the shape of the system in the moment in which you did it? So that if we have people who are changing the scenarios over time, if they're iterating in the same space, we can sort of, like, as closely as possible, we can reproduce what the system looked like at the moment that a person gave an answer, which means sort of duplicating some data, but sometimes that's good. There's a response capture system that grabs every voice, text, radio button input. The audio goes to AWS to get and to IBM Watson to get transcribed right away. And then it goes into a data module, which keeps every record. There's a table which has every action for every person in every scenario. That gets piped in different ways to facilitator dashboards, to people who are sort of live facilitating things. One challenge often is that instructors can make everyone in a group do something, and should be able to see all that data, but researchers shouldn't be able to see all that same data. So you'd only be able to see the data of the people who consented to participate. So we have a couple of different systems to pass the data to the right people. And we worked with Carolyn Roseanne on a project to think about how to deal with the AI classifier. Every response sort of goes to this subservice where it can make a call to AI classifiers that basically live anywhere. We have some that live on our Heroku instance, but for instance, we can make calls against Carolyn's Bazaar infrastructure to use the classifiers she's already built to be able to have those classifiers trigger actions on our system. A few different kinds of studies that we've done. We try to take this and embed it in lots of different parts of the teacher education system to see where it works. We do some things direct to teacher learners through MOOCs. We do some things with colleges of education. We do some things with districts. These are just teasers for things you can read in the paper or other papers. We have a MOOC study, which we think might be one of the largest studies of digital clinical simulations ever. It only has 963 learners in it, so it's obviously not good enough to make Kumar's list. But we had people go through 4 digital clinical simulations about equity, and we could measure in those simulations that over time, people who came into the class with sort of less desirable equity attitudes ended up behaving in simulations more like people with the most desirable equity attitudes when they came in. We did a great, here's a study where we had 9 different computer science teacher educators design scenarios, and we measured each scenario to the degree which it generated cognitive dissonance, which turns out to be pretty important in these kinds of clinical simulations. And everyone in our program built scenarios with like roughly the same degree of cognitive dissonance across the scenarios, which was kind of interesting to us that a similar training program would lead to authoring practices that seem to have similar results in this one dimension. Here's a thing which didn't work, which was great to learn. We were teaching a group of math coaches about inclusive discussions. And you can't have inclusive discussions in math if you don't admit the voices of kids who have incorrect or inefficient answers. If the only people you call on are the kids who are right, then the kids who are not intuitively right all the time aren't going to want to participate in math. So we do a pre-test, we do a post-test, we have them practice in small group situations and kind of whole class situations. At the beginning, they don't do so good. On the small group task, they do pretty well in the post-test. They start calling much more and in more interesting ways on students who have incorrect or incomplete answers and incorporating their thinking in neat ways. We have them do the whole group task in the simulation, and they're basically no better. So they're in this zero stakes environment. We've been telling them for months that they should call on kids with incorrect and incomplete answers. They've told us they value that. We put them in a simulation, and they don't do it. Why? We don't know, but we failed, and we found out really quickly and cheaply that we failed. If we were to actually try to follow these teachers out into the field all across schools in Boston and figure out whether or not our teaching really had an impact on their practice, that would be quite expensive. It was quite cheap for us to figure out, like, if they're not doing it in this simulation, they're really probably not doing it out there in the field. So that was one of my favorite studies there. Maybe last I'll mention that we have this community of, I won't even mention that. We have this community of practice that meets twice, it meets on Wednesdays and Thursdays, usually on the first and third weeks of the month. I help facilitate it, but it's mostly run by my colleague, Sara O'Brien. If working with this is of interest to you, it's totally free. Come, email us and we'll get you a login into the system and you can come to one of these meetings and we can help onboard you and get you authoring scenarios and playing around and looking at data, supporting your studies or your learning design or those kinds of things. Feel free to go to teachermoments.mit.edu and just click on some scenarios and see what's there. We're like just about to launch a much better kind of welcoming interface. So if you actually like wait a week, it'll look cooler, but it works fine now. And if you can either look up Jeremy's journal or go to bit.ly/Jeremy's journal and you'll get one example scenario, which is one of our favorites and a pretty cool one to play through. So that's one of the things that we're working on to try to make professional learning more practiceful, particularly around improvisational interactions between professionals, colleagues, and folks they work with. And I'll take whatever questions people have.
Thank you, Justin. Okay.
You said that box plot measured cognitive dissonance. How do you quantify cognitive dissonance?
Yeah, we did it a couple different ways. One is there's like measures of cognitive dissonance. And so there's some cognitive dissonance instrument that we used right afterwards. And then we think that there's some correlation between cognitive dissonance and confusion. And so actually one thing that we have built into the system is people give their responses. And then afterwards we ask them, were you confused? Like listen to yourself again, do you feel like you're confused? It's actually something that's really important to Garron. He wants to build AI classifiers around these things, and it's really important to him that participants are involved in the labeling of the data that trains the classifiers. Like the participants should be able to say when they're confused or not. Whether or not you think confusion is the perfect proxy for cognitive dissonance is a good conversation we have. And then really briefly, like the reason why cognitive dissonance is important in these scenarios, like a pretty typical behaviorist notion of learning is like a person does something and you tell them it's wrong and they do it differently, or tell them it's good, they do it the same. And that can change people's behavior. Another way that you can change people's behavior is you can get them into a moment where they do a thing which is not aligned with their values and they realize it. That actually comes up a lot in these kinds of scenarios. There was one of our colleagues at Syracuse, Ben Dodger, does really cool work with actor-based simulations around inclusive special education, where they talk all semester long about how important it is to include special education students in classes. And then he does an actor-based simulation where a paraprofessional comes up and says, hey, I think we should pull that kid out. And a shocking number of his students will be like, oh yeah, I guess it makes sense in this case. And he'll go back and look at like little bits of the artifacts of the scenarios afterwards and be like, hey, everybody, like, remember how all semester we said it was really important to include kids? And in this one moment when we asked you, you didn't? And so those kinds of pieces of cognitive dissonance, we think can be helpful in thinking about behavior change.
All right, it's really interesting. I'm curious if there's a formalized required TA training program for grad students at MIT, and if so, whether you could lean on the people who administer those programs to give you scenarios.
Yeah. We just did this with the physicists. I don't. Somebody on my staff did it, so I don't remember a ton of it. Yeah, but we think that there's a bunch of moments. For the key is there's a. I mean, that's a good example because actually, like, there's a zillion things that you need to do well to be a TA, and the amount of training you're going to get is like pretty darn close to zero. So part of what you have to think about too in those circumstances is like, if you could only pick a couple of things that are the most important for TAs to practice, what would those things be? One of the things that we might push on people, but this is our bias, would be scenarios around eliciting learner knowledge. Novice educators are very keen on fixing people. And one of the things that you can do before you fix people is to figure out what they're actually thinking. And your approaches to fixing people can sometimes be a lot better if you take a little bit more time to really try to understand what they're thinking instead of your assumption of how they're thinking is wrong. But yeah, we love working with folks in all kinds of environments to like physics TAs.
Thanks, Justin. I want to use this. I have a question. I really like the idea of breaking it up into small pieces of deliberate practice, but one of the things we know about deliberate practice is deliberate practice with targeted feedback and repeated performance helps improve the deliberate practice. So I'm curious, I didn't see where the user gets feedback on their performance.
So typical routines for these kinds of clinical simulations involve at least 2 cycles of feedback or reflection. One is users go back and review their own data, and we can help them do that by saying, here are all the different pieces that you did. Oftentimes trying to choose one piece that seems really important to them, and then bring that back into some kind of whole group discussion where there's some feedback on that. I would say, actually, in teacher education, there's a bunch of places where deliberate practice is not the right metaphor, because I understand deliberate practice, it has a targeted endpoint. Like when Erickson's working with musicians, they know what a virtuoso performance sounds like. And lots of places in teaching, we actually have disagreements about what high quality performance is generally, and in particular, what high quality performance in a specific situation would look like. So part of what we're doing, part of the feedback process for us sometimes is not saying, here's a better way or here's a worse way, sort of like, here's some competing decisions that, that reasonable people might make in those circumstances and things like that. The AI is meant to try to get some more of that built in more quickly. And then, trying to build these things into sequences of learning experiences, that have multiple opportunities for practice that build on each other and stuff. I'll tell you one idea that my staff had that I thought was totally stupid and worked great. We were making this online class, and we'd always believed that group debriefs were really important for these kinds of scenarios, sort of facilitating conversations together. And I was like, that's just not going to work online. Like, you go to forums or whatever, but it's not going to work. And they were like, let's film people do it and have other folks watch that. I was like, that's dumb. You're not going to participate. You're just going to watch people having these discussions. But we had groups, groups of educators do some of the scenarios, talk about it, be sort of individually interviewed real world style, and then cut these little 3 or 4 minute debrief videos. And I couldn't say for sure that they worked, but participants really, really liked them and identified very quickly with the teachers in there and saw key themes and stuff like that. So that's another thing that we've tried. It's not exactly the same as personalized feedback, but it's getting at some of that.
Time for one last question.
I guess along the same lines, I was wondering about the Facilitator Dashboard. So what actually gets populated there, and have you guys done any studies about manipulating the data that's populated there as far as the facilitator and how they interact back with?
No, we've done UX studies. I don't have a good slide of what it looks like, except it's a grid where it's relatively easy to see all the prompts. And then you see all the responses. One of the things that people like compared to, so in lots of different kinds of clinical simulations, the data output is one really long video file or one really long audio transcript. So if you went to the medical school, Weill Medical School Martha was talking about this morning, they'll have a clinical simulation room, and they'll have robots, and they'll have nurses, and they'll have trained actors and things like that. And the data readouts from those things are pretty complicated. There's some things about organizing our scenarios by slides that are kind of dumb. You have to click to next and things like that. But actually, if you want to figure out what's going on, having these really discrete moments is pretty helpful, because it's not that, because we've structured our data now in certain ways, and it's not that hard. We have one scenario called Jeremy's Journal where the key moment is Jeremy comes to you and is like, I can't take the quiz today. And we say, and you're like, well, maybe you should take the quiz. He's not that, he's here. And so you sort of have to, but the prompt is, what exactly would you say to Jeremy in that moment, which is both making a decision about whether or not you're going to make him do the quiz and how he'll respond. So what in that case, the facilitator would get a table with sort of Watson transcripts of everyone's responses, which are pretty close to good enough to seeing what they said, and then also a link to the audio file so they could actually listen to all of them. Yeah, but playing around with what people, right now we just kind of give people the everything in context, but playing around with that would be cool. Oh, but I should be done. You all should go take a break. Thanks, everybody.